All right, ready to go? Okay, welcome to the Kaysville City Planning Commission for Thursday, February 14th. The first item on our agenda is the opening and approval of minutes of the January 10th meeting. Do you have a motion?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes from January 10th.
Second. Aye.
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 Okay, off to a roaring start. Number 2, conditional use permit for eyelash extensions at 443 East, 100 South for Montana Turnbow.
Okay, I'll give a brief introduction to that, and then Ms. Turnbow is here this evening if the Planning Commission has any additional questions of her. But the property located just east of us in this neck of the woods, 443 East, 100 South, where Ms. Turnbow is hoping to have, by appointment, about 3 days a week, have customers come to her home for eyelash extension services. The appointments take about 2 hours apiece. And so when she's doing it, she only expects maybe 3-4 people a day. Would be pretty much typical. Based on how that operates in my conversation with her, it wasn't too much concern on traffic. She's got space in the driveway where a car could pull in when the appointments come by. And so staff's recommended approval without the need for additional conditions. And I myself would be happy to take questions as well if you have them.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Montana, would you like to say something? Okay. No. Let the record reflect. Okay. All right, then. Take a motion if we're ready for it.
Okay, I'll make a motion to approve a conditional use permit for major home occupation B eyelash extensions for Montana Turnbow at 443 East, 100 South.
Second.
You get to start us down.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Great. Congratulations. Good luck. All right. Next is a conditional use permit for major home occupation B swimming lessons for Ruben Bell at 1665 West Leola.
Okay, similar application type, another home business. This one on the southwest part of town off of Leola Lane. Ruben has children who would be interested in offering swimming lessons. They have a swimming pool on site, and it's an outdoor pool, so it would be during the summer when they're not in school. Neighborhood kids and such would come over for lessons, likely beginners. Typically 4, maybe 6 students at a session is the anticipation. They're about 30 minutes long each, and there'd be some gaps in between sessions as kids come and new ones go. Looking at the property, in itself, it's a large property and it's got a lot of frontage, but around it, there's a significant amount of frontage on both sides of the street, so people can pull in, drop off kids or wait for a minute if they needed to. In many cases, well, I'll let them maybe correct me, but occasionally, as short as the lessons are, people will often stay with the children for it and then head home with them. Based on that understanding, our ordinance does require that there be a limit placed either on the number of vehicles or the number of students based on the business. And with that, in my discussion with the applicant, we're recommending limiting the number of students to no more than 8 during any session to appease that section of the ordinance. So with that, if there are questions, I'll turn it back to the Planning Commission and be happy to answer those. The applicant is here this evening.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Should we have the applicant come up? All right. Go ahead and state your name, please. And
My name is Ruben Bell.
do you want to add anything to that?
No, it's just for my daughters. They're wanting to save money for college. One's 18, the other's 14. And it will be just beginning swim lessons for younger kids, and they will just probably mainly mornings,
Okay.
being done early afternoon.
So you might have guessed that the number one concern, if there is one, would be just traffic and
Yes.
parking and having the kids come in and have it be safe and So that would be the number one concern, and the way these conditional use permits work is that if it turns out to be a burden or difficulty, then the staff might hear of it, and then you'd come before us and we'd try to work that out, or if worse comes to worse, would revoke the permit. So
Okay.
I would just say keep an eye on how that looks and how it works. We don't want to have any, of course, any accidents, but even, the inconvenience, or if there's congestion, try to work through that so that there's not a problem and then everything goes well. So,
Okay. Good.
anything else? Okay, let's
Good luck.
hear a motion.
I'd make a motion that we grant a conditional use permit for a major home occupation B swimming lessons for applicant Ruben Bell at 1665 West Leola Street, with the stipulation, according to the recommendation by staff in the report, that the number of students at any given session be a maximum limit of 8.
Second.
Aye.
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 Great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, next, conditional use permit for model home signage and flag lots for Ivory Homes at 1876 West, 75 South.
Okay, just by way of introduction to this is for the model home at the Apple Blossom subdivision. It's a little bit close in on the map, so hard to tell, but you're just south of 200 North off of Angel Street, where the subdivision's located. That lot where the model is proposed is outlined there in yellow. The house is essentially built, as is much of the subdivision. It's a 7-lot subdivision, so not necessarily a very large one, but they do have the spec that they want to use for the model, and are looking for, under this approval tonight, a temporary approval for the model home for a period of up to 1 year. Together with the model home, they are requesting approval for a 3x6 model home sign that's also on site that, as stated in the staff report, fits within the development's signage provisions and is compliant with that. That's allowed. They had looked at maybe doing some flags based on my review with that. And you can see in the report we allow flags, so I know they often fly an American flag on site, but any flags that are used to essentially have a company logo would not qualify within that. So we've talked to them about that, and they're the understanding that those would not be permitted on any flagpoles. Again, just based on the absorption rate that they're looking for within that, I think the year should be sufficient on this particular subdivision. And so based on understanding of that, you can see here the site itself, a little bit tough to see on this, but the corner lot, you've got the model home sign, flagpole towards the corner. They've got ample space off the driveway and within the cul-de-sac, I think, to handle the amount of traffic that will come in and out of there. And so staff is recommending approval of the conditional use for the period of 1 year, or until all the lots within that subdivision are sold, whichever comes first. And then we need to work with them to verify that the proposed sign location with the dimensions is outside the clear vision triangle. Having been on site, I think it's good to go, but I've got to double check some measurements with that so I could follow up on it. And that the sign height and everything be in place. And that final condition, again, as I talked with them, is we wanted to ensure there are no blade or flag signs, as they're simply not permitted within the ordinance and not necessarily under the purview of the Planning Commission to permit them, as it's stated. So with that, they do have their representative here this evening. I'm happy to answer questions myself if you have them of me, and I'll return it back to the Planning Commission.
Thank you. So, Commission.
I do have a question for the applicant. In the letter that they sent, they're requesting a
Right.
few flags.
Why don't you come forward, state your name,
Tyler Carlson,
and you're with,
Ivory Homes.
okay.
In your request, it says we would like a few flags. Can you clarify what a few is? Because a few to some people is 35.
Right. 4 to 6.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but that excluding the American flag. So 4 to 6 of our own, like, marketing flags.
Okay.
So would you be comfortable with us putting a limit on 6 on the number of flags?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Is there so the height limit on that? Is there regulation on that? They're not terribly tall. I'm just curious.
So any flagpole that's under 30 feet in height would just typically be permitted. If you want to go beyond that, the planning commission needs to give specific approval.
Okay.
Anything else? Should we?
Well, and I'll just state again within this, so for specific to the flags, so they've proposed them and requested them under their initial application, and you can see them here on the site plan. They've just kind of got approximate locations where the 4 would be. Then you have the American flag that would be out towards the other street. So under a model home, the Kaysville City ordinance allows for pretty specific sign types. So the flag, if it's on a flagpole, if it says Ivory Homes or such and such company, would be considered a sign. And so in order for it, unless it displays the emblem of a nation or state, then it is a sign rather than a flag. So if they're 12 foot or less and our square footage matches up, then they can fly those flags or signs. But if they are to be used 30 feet up in the air, then it wouldn't meet the provisions of our ordinances.
So it's not a flag unless it's a country or state. Otherwise, it's considered a sign. Okay.
I have one question. Is it lit? Is this flagpole?
The American flag?
Well, all the flags
No,
would
just
have
the
lights.
American flag.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
that's the only one that will be lit.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Just lit from the bottom, yeah. So
Okay.
the other ones, no, we don't usually do that.
Yeah. Okay.
So then, for what we're doing here, Lyle, those are not flags per our definition of the ordinance. They are signs.
They would be signs.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they certainly have requested one American flag, but the others would be signs. And we often see, I call them blade signs. Some people call those flags. I don't believe that was their intent on that particular type. Those are not permitted in a residential zoning district. And then, but again, they do have some square footage available for model home signage, and how the flags would fit in, I think, would be quite creative. I forget your coworker that I've Jake in touch with over the phone. My conversation with him is he's not expecting to put up those flags based on what I've spoken with him about and their ability to do so, other than the American flag.
Okay. Ready to make a move here? Josh, you saving your stuff up for the controversy later?
I don't know what you're talking about.
So I just have one quick question on the recommendations, Lyle. You say that no blade flag signs are allowed as the code does not permit them. So could they not have the flags that they're talking about then?
Let me come back into my recommendation and read it with you.
That's the last one.
So I believe they're welcome to put up flagpoles all day long and fly state of Utah or other signs, but if they put a company logo on them, then it would be out of compliance.
Okay.
So we wouldn't restrict the number of flagpoles necessarily.
So they could have flagpoles, they can run, they can fly.
But they have to be.
Kaysville City emblem, or you name it, but yeah.
But if they're flags, and they have to be below 12 feet if they're not going to be
Considered a sign.
the.
Correct. As soon as it's got a company logo on it, then it's got to be
Then it's a
meet our
sign.
square footage,
Yeah.
height of the 12 feet, and that. So I don't suspect that's what their interest is doing, but if they were willing to meet that, I personally don't know that that's problematic.
Yeah, so if they put just like a colored banner on there, a colored flag, a red flag or a green flag or something, that would count as a flag then, not as a sign. Yeah.
Probably.
Probably. Okay.
I can read the text of the ordinance that specifies that if you would like. Let me find it here real quick to clarify
Doesn't sound
that.
like there's much controversy. So.
All right.
Okay. We ready to move?
Sure. Make a motion that we grant conditional use permit for model home signage and flag lots for Ivory Homes at 1876 West, 75 South, with the stipulation of the requirements being as those that are recommended in the staff report.
Second.
Aye.
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 Aye. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck. Okay, next is a conditional use permit for church meeting house, bought Pantone Architects, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at 2100 West, 200 North.
Okay. So you'll recognize likely this property. We've addressed under multiple occasions with the recent rezone. You'll also recognize it again later tonight on the final plat that essentially creates the lot where this building would be located. So a lot of things tied together. Essentially, it was rezoned to the R120 by the City Council recently with the development agreement, ultimately for the purpose of a church meeting house. And so you can see within your packet and here on the screen the elevations showing roughly what that building would look like. Fairly typical of buildings for the Church of Jesus Christ that we see throughout the community. The site plan shown here on the screen, you have the building that fronts 200 North with the parking in the rear, essentially circulates around the entire building with 2 access points onto 200 North. They provided some landscaping around the perimeter, around the building, and a few landscape islands within the parking lot. Based on my working with them on our meeting ordinance compliance and getting their required landscaping in place. Bear with me, I apologize, just getting to my notes. So my review, based on the size of the building, and I'll show maybe a couple more exhibits. You got the landscape plan here. I don't believe this showed up in your packet. There was an error on the PDF. So this is the missing page. That just shows their layout and generally how the seating works within the chapel. So they've got some different numbers on how our ordinance specifically calculated, but I show that there's a seating capacity of about 879 seats, requiring 175 parking stalls. They have provided that and then some on the property, so it seems to be sufficient there. It's to be used as a stake center, is my understanding with it, so they're I think preparing themselves, understanding that they may have larger events where they want the additional parking to handle any anticipated crowds. Based on what they put together and where I've worked with them to this point, staff's recommending approval as proposed. Of course, as a conditional use permit in the Planning Commission, you've got the purview to look over it. Again, seeking to approve, but should there be any reasonably anticipated detrimental impacts, if you can make a nexus to them in time to our standards, you're welcome to place a condition that you feel is appropriate on the site to improve it. The architect is here this evening, should you have questions of him, and I'd also be happy to take any myself. And with that, I'll return the floor to the Planning Commission.
Thank you. So I think I have that page that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Oh, did it work? Okay.
When you consider the seating per parking stall ratio, do you consider it to be in its full maximum capacity to get to that number?
So the way I looked at it, and they show some pretty large capacity potential based on classrooms and everything, possibly hosting groups. What I've done is essentially use the chapel and overflow gym type area and base the capacities off of that.
So I look at this picture and there's lots of these little blocks. Is that a seat that you're counting?
Yeah, let me go back to the... So in this particular picture, where my calculations base off of is this chapel area here on the left, the gym overflow and overflow, I think is what it's called. I've probably had a different name. So these other classroom areas around the perimeter were not calculated within that based on my recommendation. Again, they've provided... So I showed 175 parking stalls. I think the number, we may not see it on this. Come back to the report, see if we know exactly how many they have.
You said 879 seats requires 175 parking stalls, and they've provided 295. So
95.
I mean, it's another almost 100%. I mean, it's probably another
Yeah,
60, 70%.
they're well over.
If you counted all of those seats, would this still be enough?
I would suspect so.
So
I didn't because, so I hopefully I'm not stating that incorrectly, but
So I'm guessing then that our ordinance is not specific enough, and if it's not, my suggestion doesn't help us now. Is the ordinance should say for a religious meeting house, parking is determined based on the main seating area or whatever you want to call it. I don't know, Wilf, if you've seen how they calculate it in other cities.
It's a lot of different ways. It really kind of depends.
Well, you think about like an elementary school. I live by one. We probably all do. When they're having an event, there's not anywhere near enough parking.
Streets are
And it creates a mess. And stake centers, if I understand it correctly, it's the periodic use, but when they use it, it's pretty full. I don't know. Is this also going to be a regular meeting house?
well, I suspect it'll have its regular Sunday
like every
meetings
Sunday
and,
as well as that, yeah.
and then main events. So
I agree with Josh. I think we ought to have it be clear so we know, because if they're going to have maximum capacity, on a monthly basis, that creates a regular congestion, where if it's a once in 10 years kind of a fluke, then maybe we don't need to plan for that much parking. But
I think Bot Pantone does a lot of meeting houses. I'm sure he would know how most cities are calculating the stalls versus square footage, seating capacity, that sort of thing.
okay, well,
And so what our ordinance states, I'll just read what we have here, and it's churches, auditoriums, assembly halls, or theaters, one space for every 5 seats. So based on, I guess, maybe tradition and then how we've interpreted that in the past, it's been that main meeting area, and with other congregations and organizations, not everyone always shows the seats in these other rooms, so it's based off pews or that chapel area. I'd be happy to quickly do the total number of seating they anticipate throughout the whole site, and I could do a quick calculation to see how close that is. So they have provided numbers based on this. A lot of it comes into the occupancy issue with building code, I think, is why they try and cite it in this direction. But if you'll allow me maybe
I
2
don't
minutes, I'll get you
necessarily-
an answer.
I don't necessarily think this is a problem with this issue before us. I think it's something that ought to get kind of clarified a little bit. But
Yeah, our ordinance could be a little more.
I mean, for example, this is the chapel. Is that a gym that's got all those seats on there?
Yes,
Yeah, and so that's temporary
Yeah.
correct.
seating, right? So I don't necessarily have an opinion on how it should be legislated or cleaned up, but I just think it should be. I think that's what Josh was saying. So
If you calculated every seat, this may not be closely, it's probably relatively accurate, I should say. How many stalls are there? 2 something?
95.
295? I think every seat, 5 stalls or 1 stall per 5 seats would be 365 stalls.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of stalls.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
a lot of.
No, that's why I say I don't think this is a problem here.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, shall we ask the architect?
He would like to come up, I think.
Why don't you come up, please?
Thank you. Brian Bott, Pantone Architects. Perhaps I could help a little bit with this. This plan that I submitted to Lyle maybe is too confusing. I haven't submitted this plan in the past. This is one that is usually shown to a stake president as we're sitting down to talk about a new meeting house. And it shows the total capacity based on building code. So that is, if we were to max out the building according to code, which would honestly never be done, that's what it would look like. I don't even believe the church provides that number of chairs to a building that would work. This being a stake center will handle stake conferences that are held twice a year. And so that center core of the building, from the chapel back through the cultural hall with chairs and even onto the stage, which now is a lowered stage. It's not up at the elevation. If you're familiar with past meeting houses, that's a lower elevation, 2 steps up is all. That's where the stake conference would be held. And in those events, the perimeter rooms would not be used because there is no overlap of schedules. All the wards in a given stake would come to a meeting in that central core. In a regular Sunday activity, the chapels now are larger than they used to be to try and keep more people in closer proximity to the pulpit and not have to go into the overflow as much as maybe in past buildings. This is a brand new building plan that we have not built yet. We've built a bundle of churches over the years, but we've not done this one yet. It's very similar, however, to just tweaked a little from the past one. And the question came up about how other cities handle the parking requirements relative to seating. And it does vary from community to community. There are those that base the parking requirements strictly on fixed seating, which would be the pews or the opera chairs or pews up in the rostrum for the choir. And there are others that take the major assembly area of the building. I've never come into a meeting where, not even a meeting, I've never run into a situation in a community where the number of stalls that the church offers now doesn't meet the zoning ordinance. In the past, those parking stalls were fewer in number, but it's just been 4 or 5 years ago that the church increased those numbers that they allow us as designers to put onto a site. We have a maximum. 300 is the maximum we are to use in a stake center situation. And we try along the Wasatch Front to come as close to that 300 number as we can.
So I have one question on that plan that shows that floor plan. So there's a number that says conference seating. Is that your estimate on a stake conference seating?
Exactly.
Okay, so in my mind, that's really the operative number we're looking at. Mm-hmm. What is the generally close maximum seating capacity? And that's 660. 1 stall per 5 that's 132 stalls if we look at 660, and they're way exceeding that. So, yeah. I mean, I think we're all on the same page. The parking isn't that big of an issue. We're just trying to get down to the number. To me, that's the right number, and there's plenty.
Great. Thank you. Anything else you'd like to add? Any more questions for the architect?
I don't think I saw anything in there. If I did, I missed it. Both in the staff report and on the plan about fencing. What's the plan for fencing?
The church would typically want to use, and what we've called for here is a chain link fence with vision slats, similar to what was done further west a year and a half ago on Bonneville Lane. I've forgotten the name of that street already. Schick Lane and Bonneville. That has, I think, the vision slats in the fence. That would be their first choice. This site, with the existing properties to the west, has some fences there that we're going to have to deal with in one way or another, whether we just leave them and leave the differing fences or just what we do, I'm not sure. In some cases, we have put our fence inside the others, which isn't always the best solution.
That was actually concerned. I got a phone call late this afternoon from Taylor Spendlove, lot 405 on this map, with that concern about fencing, that there not be 2 fences, that the church didn't come and put a chain link fence next to their tan vinyl fence. Wanted to know if there's any way they could match what was there.
I don't think the others are vinyl though, are they? I think the lot out on 200 has kind of a unique fence. If I remember correctly. It's been weeks since I've been out there, but
I actually didn't have time to go by there prior to this, so I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone else.
There have been cases as well, and the church would go vinyl if they needed to along that property line. Their preference isn't vinyl just because it doesn't hold up as well over time, but if that's necessary to keep the neighbors satisfied, that wouldn't be an issue. I just don't think
Would they use vinyl in that section?
They're all the same there.
Would they use vinyl in that section and chain link in the other areas, or would they try and stay consistent throughout the property, or?
Well, we're working on one now in Layton. That's the situation, that they've got different subdivisions with different restrictive covenants that the church is not held to, but they have 2 different colors of vinyl fencing.
Oh.
And we're trying to deal with that one now too.
No.
But this is a little bit different situation. If it needed to be vinyl, the church has typically gone vinyl if that's requirement, but there is that concern that just doesn't hold up as well over time. Church uses a heavy gauge chain link fence, and it's proven to be a very durable fence system. And the vinyl slats that go in it, if we needed to match a color to some of the neighbors, we could do that. The concern in this case is that we have a variety of fences, if I'm not mistaken.
My preference, although I'm not generally in favor of dictating aesthetics, but is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to double up a fence. So you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes the church will have the chain link fence with the slats, and then somebody else's fence a matter of inches behind it.
That has been done before.
See, and I would prefer to not see that, but.
I would too, but I'd also prefer it to be consistent all the way. So
So
when type of material all
be
the
our
way around.
challenge.
Yeah.
It's not gonna, may not be possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, do we want to include that, or are we ready to make a motion here?
I mean, so maybe this is just me, but just to be clear, I mean, you know, there's some standards that essentially we're to look at for, you know, that are listed in the staff report. Number one is pretty subjective to, I guess a lot of them are, but adequate access. I don't think there's a problem with access here. Safe circulation, same thing. There's sidewalks and the cars can come in and out. Adequate parking, we've already talked about. I'm assuming, Lyle, that the city public safety and or engineering, you know, capacities have looked at things, or no?
We have, as far as the turn radii and access points for fire apparatus and vehicles. We haven't gone through the building permit process to verify the calculations on storm drain and such, but that will be necessary.
But that'll come.
Yeah.
Architectural design, exterior finishes, again, that gets into aesthetics that I don't like dictating that personally, but landscaping is the same way, even though I do have a pet peeve on that, but I let it slide, I suppose, just personally. I think site lighting was addressed in the staff report. Everything's going to be downcast, directed lighting, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Utilities, same thing, is going to be adequate. Water runoff. So is there going to be detention in the front? Is that what that is, all that lawn in the front?
There is a detention area in the front.
Yeah. So yeah, the only thing issue I had was the fencing question. It sounds like it's being addressed, and yeah. So I don't know that there's, from my perspective, extra conditions that are necessary here.
I don't think so either.
I agree.
Somebody ready to make a motion? Thank you.
Oh, am I doing it?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. No one else is.
Okay.
You're
I'll
quiet today.
make a motion to grant a conditional use permit for a church meeting house by Bott Pantone Architects at approximately 2100 West, 200 North, with the recommendations included in the staff report,
Which
Second.
is none, right?
such as,
Do we need to list all of them?
Well, I don't know. The
I don't think there were
recommendation
any.
I was going to
says
say,
none,
so there were none. Never mind.
Okay.
With zero recommendations, since there were none.
We have no recommendations.
Recommending approval. I'll second that.
I think it's.
Aye.
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 Thank you. Okay. Next is a public hearing and preliminary plat review for the Westgate subdivision Perry Homes at, you might have guessed, 2300 West, 200 North, Schick Lane. Do you want to lead us into it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to. So just recently, again, this one went through a rezone process. We got the map that was used to delineate which zones went where within the property. Perry Homes did that in anticipation of this specific subdivision. In fact, at the time, they had an exhibit very much like the preliminary plat that you'll be reviewing here this evening. So very much consistent with what we've looked at up to this point on consideration of the project. Just to kind of show in brief, they're looking to start developing. There's over 120 homes on the property, about 3 acres of commercial space that will be right off the West Davis corridor interchange, and then the north section of what's essentially already a park property, but part of some homeowners association space. And Perry Homes owns the other half, would be dedicated to the city as a public park. So the subdivision, just getting in my report on the details, bear with me. I think I'm still learning this paperless thing along with you guys. So the 122 lots within the R18 zone here on the western edge of the property. There are 37 total lots within that. That's our 65 foot of frontage or greater. Each one of those lots meets that. You can see within the circulation, that's the only section of the subdivision where there is a cul-de-sac or dead-end street. It's very short, so we feel comfortable with that on the staff level, and meets the radius and such that's necessary within our ordinances. Within the R1 LD zone, which is the remainder of the residential, that's 2 unit per acre type development. We have the remaining 85 lots. There are lots that range in size from 12,000 square feet, but they get as large as nearly an acre and a half at 61,000 square feet. And you can see the large lots, they essentially run under. There's a power line, transmission corridor that kind of goes over the park. They've also provided the trail connection that essentially, based on Layton City's planning and ours, would feed up to the Case Creek Trail when Layton City makes a connection over time. Fairly straightforward. There's no PRUD element. They're not asking for any exceptions to setbacks, side yards. There's no common shared open spaces with it. Again, the open space that's shown on this would be dedicated to the city. Based on that, staff's opinion, at least is at the preliminary level, that we're ready to recommend to the Planning Commission that a favorable recommendation be passed along to the City Council for a final decision. With that, Perry Homes is here this evening. If you'd like to ask further questions of them, and
First, I want to open the public hearing. Okay, I'll close the public hearing unless there's anyone else I missed. Okay. So I was curious about this path, the connection. Tell me what that's connecting to. I mean, you're saying the Layton one's not there. It's not in place.
Correct. So
but is
I
it
get
south
to
of
a
it?
different map. So Case Creek is essentially the Layton City Kaysville border on the our north end. And they do have a trail system that runs through this area. I think it's a little bit north, actually, of this image. And they've shown on their trail planning running a path through this area.
Is that part of the path right there that we see that runs into that yellow?
I don't believe it is, actually. So I think it's a dirt path that runs into the farm, but that's the correct area that you're looking at where they would do that. So that property is not annexed into Kaysville City. It is part of Layton City's jurisdiction, and it's part of the open space of this subdivision that you can kind of just see on the top left end of the screen. But that's Layton City's, we believe we'd be creating that connection and the final piece of that from their plans.
And does that connect to something that's existing in Kaysville?
So within Kaysville, it would ultimately get you to the park and the path system around that. And then to the south, it ties into, there's a trail system that you can see a little bit here if you follow my mouse on the screen. It's just south of the equestrian. Ultimately, that runs currently into the edge of town. Maybe I'll pull up a Google map so we can look at it closer. But when the West Davis corridor comes in, at least as far as trail connections, we believe there's some opportunities to connect. If you've ever been on the Legacy Trail, something very similar would be installed with the West Davis corridor, and this could be one of those types of paths that connects into that large facility. So just to give you an idea, so you can see the trail to the south just stops at the city border. But again, that's where the West Davis corridor is, just going right outside the city border, so we would eventually have to make those connections. But
So where's on that map, where's the development cost? Right there?
yeah, so we have the public park, the open space for the subdivision that feeds into this trail.
And that's considerably west of the rail trail, right?
Correct.
Oh.
So the rail trail over here by the
That's
Smith's
Smith's right there,
Marketplace.
So the right-of-way for West Davis corridor is not all the way at the end of Schick Lane. It's right, those two long rectangular pieces, it's on the eastern, that's it right there.
Within Kaysville City, UDOT owns these two properties. So for the most part, we stopped annexing to preserve the corridor, but in this specific case, it actually comes into Kaysville City. The school and this home, the freeway will be right next to them.
And so there's a portion of the city and there's property west of the right-of-way.
Yeah, west of the right-of-way, much of that's owned by Nature Conservancy and is wetland property. The commercial pad that they're proposing is here on the north side of Schick Lane or 200 North, which would be right off of that interchange.
And then what's that road that was to the west?
Let me pull that back up.
Looks like it's kind of yeah. What's that long one? Right
So this provides some access to a few outlying homes and properties that are an unincorporated county. So that would be maintained and retained even with the West Davis corridor project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure all of it's paved.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well.
And again, just showing the phasing on the project. So with I'm swapping over to PDF here. They are looking to start from 200 North, and as we get into the final plat, we'll get into the details on these, but they're looking to start from 200 North and then head north from there. But very consistent as far as where the R1LD ties into the R120 neighborhood on the northeast edge of this development, similar lot sizes and frontage, the like. Mostly where we're seeing a little bit variation down to the 12,000 square foot lots is well outside of connection to existing neighborhoods, so it seems to transect pretty well from existing developed surrounding subdivisions.
Are those roads maintained by the city or are those private?
Yeah, so each one of these roads would meet city standards and would be a public street.
Okay.
And of note, so they complete the connections in multiple points within this development. I'll go back out to the map. So they'll be building a new road that connects what's now a dead end here at the end of Eulalia. I'm going to mix up the street names. I think this one's Eulalia and our other street up here. So these will connect through. So again, that complete circulation that we've been anticipating for these previously developed subdivisions. And again, that road will connect down through here, connecting Bonneville. It does provide also the access on the patio home subdivision. So when we did the rezone, essentially the only concern that came up was they didn't want cut-through traffic into their subdivision. We'll still require that the streets connect as a city when we get to that final plat in the specific phase where that's considered. We may have to look at a gate or some type of controlled access for them to meet that accommodation, but we do want as a city that option of getting into their neighborhood from these new streets.
So here's a rather irrelevant question, but Eulalia Lane, is that existent? Is that the name of the road that it connects to, or is that a new name?
That is an existing name, so
I think.
Yeah, looks like
we'll
it.
get back in here.
I was more interested in.
Eulalia Way here is
I can spell Thunder
dedicated.
Road, so I just was curious why.
Do you have to be a Bruce Springsteen fan in order to live on Thunder Road?
Well, I thought that was not Bruce Springsteen, but I thought it was who's the Vince? No, what's that country singer? Garth Brooks. Yeah,
Garth Brooks.
That's very possible, but
I think it's Garth Brooks.
That's the Thunder Rolls.
Oh, Thunder Rolls.
Thunder Road is Bruce Springsteen.
Okay.
Garth Brooks may have done it.
Thunder
years
Rolls
later,
is
I don't
Garth Brooks.
Oh, okay.
Come on now.
know. I don't know.
I'm not really a big
I don't
fan of
know
either.
country music.
I'm not really a big fan of either, so I'll plead ignorance. Okay.
So we'll stick with Yulia Way instead.
Yeah.
Yulia Bay.
Well, there's a new song coming out on that one, I'm sure. All right, so what else do we need to discuss here?
Remind us or me, what, if any, discretion do we have in something like this?
On this one, not a whole lot. So because they're not asking for a PRUD and any exceptions to any setback and that type of criteria, mainly where you may have a little bit of discretion is kind of the road network and layout. So if there are anticipated issues or problems with how that connects or how it might help other development in different areas. But because it is a standard under each one of the zones that they've been approved for, the discretion's quite limited, and it becomes a lot more administrative than legislative on does it meet the requirements of the zones in which they're developing.
Okay.
Which, by the way, is a I guess it depends on which side of, or which sort of ideology you have, but is a reason, because we have little discretion here, if you want to have more discretion, it's good, which I think we did in this case, have the plat pretty close to what it looks like now, or the layout, when we rezoned it. That's when we have discretion, when we rezone. Now, granted, you don't have to have a plan before you when you consider a rezone, and I don't know that I don't even know if it's in our purview to require a plan before we consider a rezone, but it would be nice because of that reason.
And like you're saying that this meets all of the requirements of the ordinance.
Yeah, for my review, again, we've not done the engineered review, that'll be a final
Yeah.
plat stage, and that's yet to be determined. But as far as lot size, lot frontage, densities, number of lots within the zoning districts, we've got our access, circulation, all the turning radii and such appear to be in order with our standards within the ordinance. And I think they've done a great job of connecting the existing neighborhoods and network and completing what we would probably expect with the system.
It looks like the connectivity is good. You said something in passing that is you talking about the one in the southwest corner, just that short dead end is that the one you were saying was small enough you didn't think it was an issue?
Yeah, so we have a 600-foot limit on cul-de-sac street. This one's under 200 linear
Wow,
feet.
no, it looks like
So,
it's good.
yeah, there is one dead end, but we didn't find that to be problematic as we looked
I
at it
like
as
the fact
staff.
that we're connecting up existing stubs. That
Yeah,
always makes me
very
feel
much.
good. As if how I felt was important, but
Although, if we're talking about feelings, and I think I expressed this in the rezone, I wish we could have connected to the other subdivisions. There's
Yeah.
one to the north.
I would agree, because you look at this is 122 lots, and there's one street
Yeah,
coming
that
out right
connects.
now.
Right.
It looks like they may have a second one here in a future phase if the property to the,
Lloyd Wood Drive.
right, isn't there Eulalia and Schick Lane and
Does
Lloyd?
Yulia Drive, does that not connect to Schick?
That will.
So it will connect at 4 points
oh, yeah. Well,
to
it's on the
Lloydwood
side,
Drive,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Eulalia
You're right, Clarkson,
Drive,
yeah.
Bonneville,
Across from
and
Yulia.
There will be
And
two.
then they
whatever the
connect.
street to be
Yeah,
named.
you're right.
I think it's across from Island Way, I think is what it's called.
I don't think those are great connections because nobody's going to go through there.
Right, right.
And I guess you could also technically count the patio home subdivision connection as another option.
If it gets worked out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like, okay. I'm wrong, they do have a little bit more access.
Yeah, I would be concerned if you had that many
Yeah.
homes and one road in and out.
Yeah,
But if I had, my best friend lived in that neighborhood up over there, I'd have to get in my car and probably drive a mile to go 100 feet.
yep. The
Which is not good
overall
Or you
planning,
could take
but-
the,
street
or you could
connectivity
take the
for the
path
area is not
and
great.
walk.
I could walk.
I know that's
There's a big fence in my way, though.
heretical.
Yeah.
All right, well, are we ready for a motion? Do we want to? Sounds like we agree that it's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
I'll make a motion that we give a favorable recommendation to the city council for the preliminary plat for Westgate subdivision for Perry Homes at 2300 West, 200 North.
Are we recommending the city council, or do we?
Yeah, so this one, they have the final say on the preliminary plat, so we are looking for a recommendation from you.
Okay, all right, I second that.
I think it's Josh.
Josh?
Aye.
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 Okay. Next, final plat. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Final plat for.
You didn't get to say anything.
Did you want to?
Thank you.
Thank you. How else would you want to spend it but here with us?
My wife said a play. I'm off the hook.
My wife's at the ballet.
Okay.
Oh,
I'm glad I'm here.
my wife's home with her 6 kids, so
Oh, gosh.
not the same. Okay, final plat for Charlie's Acres at number 2, 4th amended subdivision at approximately 2100 West, 200 North for Terra Venture Development.
Okay, so we just looked at one of these lots for the church meeting house building. This is the property at 200 North and Angel near the corner. We've recently reviewed the preliminary plat on this. We've just been, as staff, looking through the construction details, namely for the curb, gutter, sidewalk, asphalt improvement along 200 North. So not a great amount of complexity or detail with that, and based on our review and look over at this plat, we feel comfortable with where it's at. Again, it includes 4 total lots, the one with the church meeting house we just discussed. It includes 2 pad sites in the general commercial zone up against 200 North. And then we have Lot 402, which is essentially created and meets what was demonstrated in the development agreement for the rezone, which would be used for storage unit type development. Each lot has access, frontage as required on it. And again, this subdivision would ultimately finish, I think that's the last stretch of improvements, at least in that area, of 200 North Street. So with that, staff's recommended approval. And on this one, because it is final, you are the final decision body and not passing a recommendation.
So without being subversive, I'll remind us that this is the one where we forwarded it with a negative recommendation, and the city council said they wanted it anyway. So now would be our chance to just say no. And then we'll see what the city council says.
But churches are a great asset to a community, so.
Yeah, well, that's a nice, I mean, it's the, I think we were concerned about the commercial,
We were,
using the commercial.
right, right.
Yeah.
That was my concern, but I am in favor of churches, just put that out there. And, and I do like the way this has come together. I like that the storage units are behind, and I think it'll look nice, so.
Any discussion, debate?
You know, a similar question to the church. It seems like storage units typically have severe fencing / walls around them.
Yeah.
Yeah. that's usually
Do we know
true.
what's proposed there? Because we just told the church to try and be consistent with the neighbors,
Yeah.
and the neighbors are about to put in a 10-foot wall. Do we want to address that at all?
We've seen most of the plat. making sure I'm not speaking out of line. So I've seen conceptual drawings and just how buildings might lay out on the property. I think they were demonstrated with the final plat subdivision. The developer here may be able to speak a little bit more to the fencing, but I don't believe we've seen the specific details. A lot of what it was, I know in the development agreement, there's some masonry type requirement for because a lot of these will go up essentially to property line rather than fencing. You'll have the building wall in a lot of cases, and so that's where I know the development agreement placed some specific requirements, but perhaps I may allow the representative to more directly answer your question regarding fencing.
I'm just curious, just for my own learning, if at this point, since we do have the ability to make a final recommendation or final approval or not, what would happen if we didn't on a project that comes back to us for final plat approval?
So in this case, if you're making a recommendation, or excuse me, a decision on the final plat approval, a lot of it's just the technical aspect of it. So because the zone has been put in place, the preliminary plat has already been recommended by this body and approved by the council. I believe that was the order it went in. Again, you may be correct. I forget exactly on what the recommendation was on the rezone, but the platting itself being much more administrative than legislative because it meets X, Y, and Z, had that recommendation. So unless you're seeking additional information, tabling it may be appropriate if there's an answer or something you're looking for. But otherwise, we're checking boxes here. Does it have what was requested of them from preliminary? Does it meet city standards and ordinances at the final plat level? So there's
If there were a lot of changes
wiggle
from the
room.
preliminary plat, then that's
Yeah.
where we would say, wait
Correct.
a second. let's
Yeah,
not wait."
but if it's
Oh,
consistent with
okay.
the preliminary.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was just curious how that process would
Yeah.
potentially work, because city council's already approved it. We've made a recommendation, it comes back. So mostly it's just
So much of it
Final.
is kind of a check on staff to make sure we've done our
Okay.
due diligence on the engineering.
Okay,
That
that's what
technically it functions, still looks and feels like the preliminary plat, and we verify that we can handle the water and traffic, and they've got the correct construction improvements for the street.
so really it's a formality more than anything.
Yeah, it is.
A little bit.
I think we have, I mean, talk about discretion, I think we have even less discretion once it gets to final plat
Yep.
than we
That's
did
what I
at
was gonna
preliminary
say.
That's right.
or whatever. And,
Assuming there's no changes, right?
right. I mean, though, let's say though, in theory, if for some reason a planning commission went rogue and said, we're going to stop this, we want to change our minds, and we in theory could unanimously vote to deny the plat without any basis, then the applicant would just have to appeal that, and they would probably win, and we would be stupid to do such a thing.
Well, right, I was
Pretty much.
just kind of wondering, so this is just formality more
Yeah,
than
the
And I
final,
think-
final plats are usually just a
Okay, that's what
formality.
I
Don't
thought.
underestimate our stupidity, John.
But I think Commissioner Sunloff's painted a good picture, though, when he talked about with the zone on the previous project, whether or not it's really in your discretion to have the plat. And I would say yes, it is. You've got all kinds of latitude under a zoning legislative process on what you want from them before you're willing to change the rules or zoning over there. You've got less discretion as it gets to preliminary plat once you've given them a zone, and even less once you get to final. So yeah, the earlier you are in a process, the more flexibility and creativity you can have to get what you want out of things. The further along you go, they've got certain expectations that they've been following what they've been told to do up to a point, and it becomes a little bit more of a formality.
Right, okay, good. Just wanted to make sure I understood that. Thanks.
Okay, with that, someone want to move?
I would make a motion that we grant final plat approval for Charlie's Acres Number 2, Fourth Amendment subdivision at approximately 2100 West, 200 North.
Second.
I think it's you. Are you up?
I seconded, so I.
Aye.
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 Okay. We'll go all the way to the front, and I think now we are item number 7, call to the public. Going once?
Close it quick.
Okay, you're limited to 20 minutes.
Right.
20 seconds.
20 seconds.
I express to you thanks for your efforts, your diligence. More than that, I can't believe you're here on Valentine's evening, and I made it in time. I'm overwhelmed. The best to each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, reports, correspondence calendar.
Okay, so as far as calendar, we're just on a normal schedule. We'll be meeting again on the 28th. Something to look forward to, I suppose. I anticipate that the green property rezone, which is the townhome project west of Smith's, may be back. So the developer's has met with the neighbors. I got an email from him the other day that included many neighbors on, that just letting them know like we were there in the process. So we're anticipating that in a couple of weeks. I think one of you has signed up for the Luau Land Use 101 training. So if there's anyone interested in that, I think several of you have probably done it before. Let us know. We're happy to let you participate. And the last thing I have, and I will let you use a little bit of discretion, but
I just want to say, when he says luau, it's not really that.
Not Hawaiian.
I went
Not
there
quite
in a
as
grass
exciting.
skirt. It was just totally embarrassing.
It's an acronym for something?
Land Use Association of Utah Academy.
Academy of Utah.
Okay.
Yeah.
More fun than a luau. Yes.
No.
If they had the pork or whatever, that would be
no.
much more enticing, huh? So I'll pass these out so you at least have them. We talked last time a little bit about business licensing, and I told you I'd come back with at least some ideas. And then I will leave it up to your discretion, being that it is the holiday, whether you want to take 10 minutes to at least go out there, if you want to spend time going through it, or if you would just like to take the information home and review it. But let me hand each one of you one of these.
Thank you.
Oh, dang, I will be gone on the
Oh,
28th.
you've been busy.
You're gonna miss the.
I'm
Heather,
gonna miss the,
you send out the emails, right, with the packets? Can you also make a PDF and attach it to with the link? I'm going to do a little more Dropbox research and see if I can figure out why it doesn't work very well for me, but that'd be great.
Well, I would be remiss, and many of you have better already, but I guess as the last report, you'll recall that Anne Marie has been switched over in position to the city recorder. So if you haven't already met Heather here, that it's taking over, we're happy to have her. And so you've started seeing correspondence come from her. Please let her know, as you typically do with Anne Marie, any questions you have. If you need help attending the luau or other items, I'm happy to include myself on it, but there's your new point of contact. So I hope you get to know her, and we look forward to having her and getting her help. So thank you, Heather. Here on this, so I'll tell you what's in it, and then again, like I said, I'll give you your discretion. The top page is what I showed you last week. I've not made any changes to it. That just kind of goes over an idea of what types of applications, at least for home occupations, we've seen over the last few years. My attempts to categorize them, you can see more specifically what they're named, and you might be able to better categorize them. And then over on the far right hand, roughly once grouped, how many we see of each and how we've been handling those. The next page, the first 8.5 by 11, just a handful of ideas. I don't know that I'm championing any one of these necessarily, but I've kind of categorized them into different ways to look into things. And then the remainder of it is the actual ordinance. So if you wanted to go in and look at what's already on the books, how we handle them, that's the next 6 pages or so behind that. I'd be happy to introduce some of the items if you want to get into the weeds on any of them. I'll let you make the call of that right now before we burn away your holiday time if you have other plans.
This may betray my ignorance, but remind me again what the motivation behind this review is. Are we trying to figure out whether there are things that we can not hear?
Yeah, so in large part, just as there are probably multiple ways to look at it, but with a couple items coming up that may be a little more time consuming for the Planning Commission, and just trying to steer this body a little bit in a direction of planning versus some of the administrative work. So if there are things that we feel are appropriate that can be taken off the plate, even if they take a few minutes, Those are a few minutes we might spend better elsewhere doing some planning, so that's part of the thinking. Whether you agree or not, we'll let you make that call. Are we serving applicants better one way or another on how we handle processes? Are we serving the public at large better one way or another on how we deal with processes? So I think those are things you can take into consideration as you're looking at this. I think we've seen over the past few years, and there are probably some home businesses where we've had probably some good discussion on and put in conditions that have made a difference on how those impact the neighborhood. The way this is broken down, whether it gives it full credence or justice, kind of indicates that there are probably some that are different than others that, maybe there's some things that are appropriate to continue to look at through a conditional use type process. Others that may fairly easily have criteria or standards that they just simply have to follow that are outlined in ordinance and applicable universally. And again, part of this is coming from the Planning Commission at a request. Commissioner Tran in particular has asked that we take a peek at it, and so we're just responding in part to that. But I think I also have some sentiment that, there are probably some ways we can make some changes, if not even just to be more specific, even if it's a very similar process to clarify certain application types, even if they continue to come before the Planning Commission. So a couple of the ideas that I just jotted down, again, you can see they're, at least I think, not in ordinance format, not completely fleshed out. Things are working great as is. We've talked about this more than one time. Doesn't necessarily take a lot of time for the Planning Commission to go over most of the business licenses. But again, it is time on the agenda, whether it's worth the applicants coming here or not for a short meeting. And we've talked about that type of deal, but we could keep it as is. Speaking with well, I'll go through these items, and I've reached out to a couple other communities to see how they're doing things, what's worked, what's not working, what are some of the differences, and there's quite a bit of variation in how every community handles it. I think by and large we probably see many more home occupation with the Planning Commission than most communities do. Some communities don't put it before a Planning Commission at all, some do just to a different degree or less than Kaysville City does. So status quo was just an idea number one, keep things as is. Idea number two, we've talked about before, is okay, maybe we still have them on the agenda, we just don't talk about them. You approve them as a consent item, much like the City Council does on their agenda, but you would have the authority or discretion to say, item 2C, I think we do need to talk about. You could pull that off and then entertain discussion and move forward. Otherwise, you're essentially approving things quickly as recommended by staff. Number three would be some significant changes within the ordinance. Finding, again, I personally don't feel that every business would be a good one to take away from the purview of the Planning Commission, but perhaps there are some, and these are just different ways that you might consider handling that. So if you got the one-chair hair salon, it seems like that's a pretty common one. I don't know that I recall ever putting a condition on that particular business. So we could either think of a specific standard as to what would be required of them that we just write in the ordinance. It doesn't have to come from you as a unique condition. It still applies to them universally. Perhaps what's already on the books is okay. A lot of the things we talk about all the time are traffic, hours of operation, that type of impact. Contractors tend to be one that's interesting. When I spoke with Farmington City, just as an example, they didn't necessarily group all contractors into one category. So we see frequently contractors who all their work takes place off-site. They're just doing paperwork at home, making phone calls. That one, they just deal with administratively. But if the contractor comes in and says, yeah, I need to keep my backhoe, on the side of my house or something, then that goes through a different process. So whether we trust people to give that right information and whether they're going to give it differently to me than to you, could be another part of the conversation. But there are even ways with specific business types to separate them. So other examples with daycare or preschools or group lessons, both Layton City and Farmington have limits within their ordinance as to how many could be had in those. Other than daycare, we do not, but we've kind of, by tradition, picked 12 as a number just because it's consistent with that. It might be good just to have one on the ordinance, whether you continue to see them or not. But Farmington was interesting, where anyone with groups in size with 8 or less individuals at a time was a permitted use. If they went above 8, then they would have to go before the Planning Commission. So, again, whether that's the right number or not, you just see different ways of thinking about things where you can separate even the exact same type of business into ones that you continue to see or ones you may not, based on anticipated impacts. That's probably enough talking about that, unless you want to dive into it more. Then the final alternative is a little more like what Layton City does. So they've got their permitted use items, but they've empowered staff to essentially function as a body that approves conditional uses. So they review them, and then they're able to place conditions as a staff on it rather than as a planning commission or city council. So very similar process, similar notice, just a matter of who is spending the time on what types of applications. So with
In a case like that, who would be the appeal body? Would that be us? If you denied somebody, would they appeal to us?
Yeah, I believe that would be the case. I don't know how theirs is set up specifically, but currently the way our ordinance is written is any decision made by staff, at least within community development, goes to the Planning Commission as the appeal authority.
Okay.
So ours is kind of already set up to be that way. I'm not sure if other cities do it differently, but I believe it's probably very similar.
How long has it been, how long have we been that appeal authority? Is it a recent thing, or is it?
Since I've been around, at least, so I can't tell you before that. We did make some changes. We recently put in an ordinance to have an administrative law judge. 6 months or a year ago, I forget the exact time frame.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
So there are certain things that were put on the plate of that, but in doing that review, it appears that at least in recent history, Planning Commission has always been the appeal authority for staff level decisions with land use.
So for all staff level decisions, pretty much?
With land use decisions. Right now, I believe variances, I forget which ones we turned over to the administrative law judge. There were a handful that we put in that court rather than staff.
Variances.
But I believe that actually is when you get appealed, it goes to that body. So I think you remain.
When we haven't touched it, it comes to us.
Yes. So Commissioner Anderson is correct on that. I believe at any time, no matter what the process, it goes to you if it's a staff decision. But instead of going to the council after you, it goes to a licensed attorney, essentially, before going to the courts.
We've always followed the law when it comes to variances, right? But, those times when the Planning Commission in the past, not us, of course, has granted variances when it didn't meet the requirements, all the elements, those probably aren't.
Just about every other city.
Those probably are not going to be granted as often with an administrative law judges, would be my guess.
They should be very rare.
Yes.
Well, we haven't granted a variance.
Well, in my opinion, we pretty well fit square pegs in round holes all the time with variances.
And that's not unusual.
Yeah. Because we sit here and we say, oh man, no one's here, nobody cares.
Right.
Let's just let them do it, and when we tweak the language, this is just how I view it. Maybe it's not what we did, but we tweak the language or we twist the facts, so to speak. Maybe not. That's maybe too strong, but to meet those elements.
But we didn't grant a variance. Did we grant a variance? I didn't think we granted.
I can't think of one that's been granted.
Yeah,
we did find one where non-conforming
misremembering
provision
that, Commissioner.
worked in lieu of the variance.
We did that, whatever you're calling it, to make it so it wasn't a grant of a variance.
Right.
Yeah, that's
it didn't
right.
require a
We interpreted the law differently.
Okay, well, I know one for sure. This has been a long time ago, but the other ones, I think you may be right. The one for sure was over on by Shepherd, and there was a rail trail, and Andy was like, no one's here. No one's going to say anything about it. Let's just do it. So on the other ones, I probably am misremembering, but anyway.
I don't think I've ever granted one, been a
The only
part of
one I
that.
can think of is that shed on Creekside
Yeah,
Lane.
where we just didn't need the
Where-
variance.
Yeah, we sort of created our own problem by approving a subdivision that was too close to the shed.
Well, and that's the reason that I was suggesting that we do some of these things that, that Lyle's put together a proposal for, so that we can go through our ordinances and look at them and drill down a little bit and provide more detail, so that we have more structure to what we're doing, so that it's more consistent, and then we're able to plan better. So that was my hope there. And I know it doesn't take tons of time necessarily, but it does take enough time that by the time we would get to this type of planning, everyone's kind of tired, and we've been here, and people have been sitting there waiting, and, you know, so that was my rationale, or my justification, or hope, that we could maybe categorize some of these and let staff
A lot of
recommend.
jurisdictions write their ordinances, so it's relatively specific, and then they can just be handled at the staff level. And if there's a challenge, if somebody disagrees, or the staff is like, I don't know about this, then they can bring it to the planning commission. But otherwise, the staff just handles them. A lot better that way.
As a general rule, that's what I think we should move to that model. Yeah.
Agreed.
Are there, so that's kind of the Model 3, and again, I don't know that I've
Yeah.
hit the nail on the head with exact criteria or something, but just to give ideas, based on what you see on the large 11 by 17, are there certain business types that you just know we got to continue to see based on experience with them? Do you like the idea of contractor, for example? I can see exactly why that can become problematic, because you get people that bring home all kinds of weird equipment and tools, but at the same time, that could be pretty easily put into code that can't be done, or where it needs to be stored. And at the same time, then you have separation of those who actually have equipment on site and a contractor who happen to be a contractor, but they don't even bring equipment home. So
Yeah, so it's not the contractor per se, it's what is going on with respect to that in-home business. So,
Right.
you just, like you said, craft the ordinance in a way that doesn't blanket all of them. It just says the ones that we're concerned about.
yeah. And even one I think that we seem to spend the most time on are, and at least off the cusp, are preschools, because they're pretty impactful. You'll have large groups, they're coming a couple times a day, drop off, pick up. Other jurisdictions, at least locally here, and haven't worked with the county for a number of years, don't do that through a conditional use process. And what's interesting, when you put limitations within ordinance rather than as a condition, you got to justify through those standards and find the nexus and the reason why you're limiting it to 8. Hopefully your ordinances are based off some of that, but it's much easier to say, here's the limit, and you don't have to dig as deep to find the reason why that limit's there, because it's the code, it applies equally to everybody. Why are we saying 30 feet is the height limit on a house? It's just what's on the book. So it gives you some power to craft things with, someone speak up if I'm offline here, but with a little bit less risk, I suppose, on where those criteria come from.
I agree, it's just standard, and then it's just nice, because that's the rule, and it applies to everybody equally.
A couple other items, just to put out here again. So, they're brief, and people are coming home after they come to their items, but just for consideration, it sounds like there's some consensus on moving this direction. But you have the applicant side to consider, so they've come to the meeting on Valentine's Day for something that, again, only took 2 minutes, but wouldn't necessarily be there. But if noticing, or that type of putting them on a meeting, put their name out there somewhere, those are other things that we can consider through different means. So we could still require that a notice be put up, or that mailers be sent out. Perhaps it's not necessary. I know sometimes neighbors get, they like to know what's going on. Conversely, they get frustrated when we have to approve the conditional use anyway. Granted, yes, we could do conditions if there are real impacts that we're considering. So just a two-edged sword. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can consider on, who are we trying to serve with the decisions we're making. Maybe we're not putting people through enough before we let them open their business, and you could go a completely different direction, and we could make it more cumbersome, or maybe we want to make it a little more simple and streamlined for them. Those are the decisions that you're considering, and we're happy to take your input and follow that direction.
Okay.
It's obviously not an action item, but is there it's time to start putting an ordinance before you, something on the effect on right standards, get them off your plate?
I would be willing to vote for that, yes. I would love to see that discussion happen. And I don't know how everyone else feels, but
Something in line with option 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, I think a notice, some sort of notice mechanism in there, that although it's staying at staff level, you give a 2-week notice or something for neighbors to comment if need be, which in most cases probably won't happen, and then you'll just make the decision. And side note, the fact that we have not ever, in my recent memory, though we've proven my memory is not very good, we haven't acted as an appeal authority to any staff decisions, which says to me that one, the staff's probably doing a good job making the right decisions, and two, citizens aren't as maybe concerned with whatever. If it were a quote-unquote wrong decision, they just take what the staff says.
I choose that the staff just is getting it right.
yeah, I
Yes. Yep, I think that's right.
Well, and if we get the ordinance right, it'll be easy to get right
Right.
most of the time. So that's where you'll have the input to say, yeah, that's clear, that isn't. I can see where that'd be hard to administer. So as we actually put ordinance language before you, we appreciate your input on items like that.
Yeah.
Giving notice for something like this, and really for anything administrative, is always a double-edged sword, because if you write an ordinance specific enough or well enough, then if an applicant can demonstrate that they meet the standards of the ordinance, then they're entitled to be granted. You get to receive the permit.
Regardless of notice.
Regardless of notice.
Yep.
And when you give notice to the neighbors think they have the ability to
They have
say
a
no.
say or whatever, yes. Right.
And
That's a good point.
generally, they base their opinion on its opinion.
Yes.
Well, I don't really want this next door to my house. Well, the answer to that is, well, that's too bad, because if they meet the requirements of the ordinance, they'll be able to do it.
Uh-huh.
And so when you give notice, then people come and they say, well, I don't want it next to my house.
Yep.
And then when we say, well, they meet the requirements and we have to approve them, then they get upset.
Right.
And then it becomes an interesting set of issues.
Yeah, I mean, in light of that, I would be.
But by the same token, if you grant something and then people don't hear about it beforehand, they're kind of like, well, how come you didn't at least tell us that this was coming? And
Well,
so
but then there's a method for them to raise concerns after the fact. But
yeah, they can
know,
appeal. They can always appeal a decision.
Yes, and if I was balancing crafting an ordinance and letting people do what they do if they meet the requirements versus notice, I would personally err on the side of, let's just craft the ordinance, let people do what they want to do, and if we don't have to give notice, then this letting them do what they want to do and having a well-drafted ordinance is better than in balancing those two, I guess.
Yeah.
And one way that I've seen that handled a little bit, specifically to daycares and preschools, is the notice isn't necessarily give us your input, not that we don't value the opinion, but letting them know what's happening, not inviting them to influence what's happening. So there will be children on your street, please watch out for them with this new business, something of that nature. So there are different ways to do the noticing as well. What are we noticing, or what are we inviting from them, can be considerations that we look at.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Well, that's
Thank
all the
you.
reports, correspondence, and calendar items I have. So unless the commission has others you would like to bring up, I will.
Motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Thank you.
Thank you.